just get this. Let's get started here. For the first order of business, if I ask everybody, please to mute yourself. It might be a little bit less distracting if you could also maybe turn off your video. If you have any questions for Matt, that we encourage you to put them in the chat, and at the end of his presentation, we'll go through all the questions that we can. And I think that's the business part of it. Welcome to this month's edition of Brown Bagging It from My Backyard. This is a service of Nature in My Backyard, which in itself is an initiative trying to encourage people to turn their yards into viable habitat and bastions of biodiversity. We have got a lot of news. This is April, and April, of course, is Native Plant Month in Ohio. And the organization that was behind the creation of April as Ohio Native Plant Month was a group called, appropriately, Ohio Native Plant Month. And they achieved that goal some 4 years ago, Nancy Lintz and former First Lady Hope Taft being the principals behind the effort. And having done so, the organization was looking for a way of actually retooling, adhering to its core educational message of trying to get people aware of the importance of planting native plants and removing invasive species. And so it's very exciting that our own Jane Ellison has become president of the board of Ohio Native Plant Month and has brought in some new trustees. And with that, the Ohio Native Plant Month has been rebranded as Ohio Native Plants. And so ohionativeplants.org, it's a one-stop shop for lots of great information for gardeners, for educators, for organizations, for communities, for growers. And it's got a really wonderful feature, and that is if you've been inspired to plant native plants in your yard, but you have that age-old question of where am I going to get them? Do not go to your local metro parks and dig them up. That's a no-no. It turns out that Ohio Native Plants is a wonderfully interactive map of the state of Ohio showing all of the native plant nurseries in the state. And further, it goes on to tell how many species of native plant and shrub or herbaceous plants do they sell? Do they use pesticides? Are they nativars? Are they cultivars? It's really a tremendous source of information. So you can find those places that are close to you and have the things that you want, and then you can responsibly source the native plants that you want to relocate to your yard to create the habitat that we all desire and that are going to attract the birds that Matt's going to be talking about. So really cool stuff. And as a companion to that, Nature in My Backyard is shifting its from the aegis of the Audubon Society of Greater Cleveland, who will continue to be a presenting sponsor, and of course, importantly, one of our founding sponsors, along with the Shaker Lakes Garden Club and the Master Gardeners of Cuyahoga County. But they will, Nature in My Backyard is shifting over to the Ohio Native Plants organization. And so in the future, that's where you'll find it. natureinmybackyard.ohionativeplants.org. So this is fabulous. So as you probably know, we bring this Zoomcast to you on a monthly basis. We bring all sorts of fabulous speakers. Matt's going to be adding to that illustrious company today. And as a reminder that we maintain videos of the presentations so that you can go back if there's pearls of information that you were worried that you missed, or you were taking copious notes and something just slipped your mind. You can go back and watch these again and again and again. And so there's just a wonderful resource, and it adds to the riches of the educational resources of Ohio Native Plants and Nature in My Backyard. So that's that. I want to cue up the fact that next month on May 13th, we'll be welcoming Elijah Crabtree, who's a naturalist and educational specialist from ARC of Appalachia. And he's going to be talking about lighting up the night gardening for fireflies. Okay, so and many people have noticed in neighborhoods that firefly numbers seem to be diminished from past years. So I think Elijah is going to be giving us pointers for what we can do to at least provide the proper habitat for fireflies so that they can continue or that they could return. Okay, today we've got a great speaker. Matt Shumar is a project coordinator for the Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative. And this is a great organization that is sort of jointly sponsored by Ohio State University and Ohio Division of Wildlife. But Matt himself has been at the forefront of bird research and bird conservation in Ohio for probably the better part of 15, 16 years now. After his being educated at Penn State University, his bachelor's and getting his master's at West Virginia, somehow this beautiful Buckeye State came beckoning, and he was instrumental um, a as a program coordinator, co-program coordinator on the second Atlas of Breeding Birds in Ohio, which was just a monumental achievement. He's co-editor of that illustrious tome, and if you haven't seen it, it's beautiful. And it was published in 2016, and it was sort of the definitive statement. 1,000 volunteers canvassing the state, looking for where breeding birds are at various confidence levels of, just singing males or do you actually see birds in a nest? And it's a benchmark for knowing where birds are and their relative numbers. And particularly when you compare them with atlases in the past, it gives you a sense of what direction bird numbers are going in the state. And to that end, he has news because he's the co-director of the upcoming third Atlas of Breeding Birds in Ohio, which I think is going to get kicked off here in the next year or two. In addition, he's president of the Association of Field Ornithologists, which is one of the preeminent groups. For instance, if you think of anybody that does banding work and banding research on migratory or breeding birds, this is their organization. And then the Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative itself is involved in everything from creating Ohio bird conservation plans to coordinating Ohio Lights Out, the Lights Out Cleveland, Lights Out Columbus, the Lights Out activities in all of the major cities, which are so important in terms of number one, actually having volunteer monitors out that rescue birds or that retrieve bird carcasses, but more importantly, that convenes all this information and allows us to know where the greatest threat in our cities are with lit buildings and with the scourge of plate glass windows, and then ultimately try to work with building owners and managers to mitigate that risk. And this is a really significant thing. And his organization has taken the lead on that statewide. So anyway, great stuff. So he's also he and his wife Molly have a place in Vinton, Ohio, and they have not only a private research station there, a bird research station, but they do banding there year round. So this is a family affair. And as you probably heard if you logged on early, he's also a musician and an incredible drummer. And as he said, he's a cat lover, but only indoor cats. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt, who's going to be talking to us about how every yard counts and how your yards can contribute to bird conservation as opposed to avian deserts in the state of Ohio. With that, I give it to Matt Shumar. Thanks, Matt.
Well, thank you, Harvey, for the lovely introduction, and to Jane and Wendy for helping to coordinate this and inviting me here. And for all of you who are jumping on a computer when the sun is shining outside and you could be spending your time outside right now. So thanks for joining and for entertaining me for the next about an hour to talk about ways in which you can really make your homes and your backyards wonderful habitats for wildlife. And we're really going to be focusing on migratory birds today because that's my wheelhouse. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started by sharing my slides here. All right. So hopefully you all can see that just fine. Okay. So I want to put this in the sort of backdrop of avian population decline. So everything that I'm going to talk about today is really things that we should all be thinking about and things that we can be doing to offset some of these bird declines that are pretty widespread. Many of you have probably seen the research that was published now several years ago in 2019 in the illustrious Journal of Science, documenting the widespread decline of avifauna across North America. So nearly 3 billion birds gone from our landscape since 1970. And so this has been sort of reshared and repackaged with sort of new summaries and new information and sort of these annual State of the Birds reports. This is one from 2019, the same year that that was released. And while we can focus a lot of our attention on the serious declines that some of these groups of birds are facing, if we take a look at species like the native residents who are sort of holding their own in many cases, but then waterfowl, we can really start to see how some of these things, these trends are different, and we might be able to learn from these conservation success stories. And really, waterfowl management is one of the great conservation success stories of North America, where we've invested so much in sort of the hunters and duck enthusiasts into wetland conservation, and the populations of these species have really skyrocketed. So I think there's a lot that we can learn by looking at some of those examples of the sort of rebound and increase in waterfowl populations and apply that to some of the serious concerns that are facing us across North America and across these many different taxonomic guilds of bird species. And so really, if we take a closer look at what that 3 billion birds gone looks like into the different birds, the vast majority of that is sort of coming from migratory bird populations. And so if you think about that in the context of what a single species that you may see on an annual basis, we've lost 2 out of every 5 Baltimore Orioles in North America since 1970. And so these are big losses and things that we have to start taking quite seriously. So our landscape has been changing pretty dramatically across this same time scale. So if we think about the early 1970s, the period in which this study looked at those bird population trends, we see pretty large scale changes in both land cover and climate as well. One of the most obvious, and climate is a large part of the story, and it often gets sort of put first in the conversation. But really, a lot of it's coming down to changes in land cover as some of the largest drivers. If we look at that sort of change in land cover and land use over really the last 20 to 25 years, we've seen a significant increase in urbanization and suburban development and sprawl around our urban areas across North America. But if we look home here, we really see that in our metropolitan areas of Ohio. So we see this ring of expansion around the Columbus area, but really all throughout northeastern Ohio, we've got more of this diffuse spread of development. And a lot of that's coming from suburban sprawl as well. And as we'll talk about a little bit later on, this is sort of where that double-edged sword lies. A lot of the issues are coming from these areas of development, but that also means that there's a lot of opportunity to address those and a lot of potential in some of those areas, as you all hold the power to help reverse or bend the curve, as Audubon and other groups like to say. If we want to get that population trajectory back positive, there are things that we can do to bend that population curve. So we have to think about who manages the land and who does this. We often sort of say, what are the agencies doing about it? But I think we have to look inward first and look in the mirror. Frankly, private landowners control almost all of the land in Ohio. So over 95% of the state is privately owned, which means that if we really want to address large-scale conservation for birds and other wildlife, we have to be doing things on this single person level, but sort of together across this entire landscape. So how do we do that? How do we manage the land of Ohio? Well, first, if we go back to those public lands, we need to support scientifically informed active management on public lands. The human population is continuing to increase. There are a lot of Ohioans now. So I think we're roughly around 12 million and increasing here in the States. And there are these continual stressors. We have more and more invasive species. We have more of this sort of edge effect and input from urbanization, from development, acting as stressors on these natural habitats. And so these often require active management in order to keep them as healthy habitats. So what we need to do is support scientifically informed active management on public lands. And this is really the only way we're able to effectively address large scale conservation issues, because these are where a lot of those contiguous patches of habitats exist, whether it's on national parks, state forests, state wildlife areas, things like that. Beyond that, we need to treat all private land as manageable habitats. And when I say that, I'm serious and saying that we need to treat everything as habitat. So that means every suburban street, we need to think about that as places that animals are living and coexisting. And are we providing the resources that they need, or are we creating these sort of ecological deserts that look clean and pretty in sort of a European manicured way, but don't really provide any sustenance or value to wildlife? And we've sort of have some of these paradigms ingrained in us for decades, even as wildlife conservationists. We've often thought about habitat as those natural places outside of urban landscapes that we sort of focus our attention on and make as high quality as possible, while sort of writing off those urban landscapes as non-habitat, essentially. So if you look at the original Partners in Flight Land Bird Conservation Plan, this was published in 2004. You will find, I think, only one mention of migration or stopover ecology in this entire document. It was really focused on, improving and creating high quality breeding habitats for these migratory and resident birds. And really, that was the mindset or the paradigm that had been ingrained in ecologists for decades, if not centuries. Even in 2016, when Partners in Flight updated their land bird conservation plan, there was this new push for full annual cycle ecology. However, many of those same paradigms were still ingrained in that thinking. So with the new guide, you'll see this sort of renewed emphasis on full life cycle or full annual cycle conservation. And what this means is that we're not only sort of addressing what these species need during the breeding season or during the nesting season, which is quite frankly when we in Ohio see most of these birds, but we have to look at what those needs and stressors are at other times of the year. So during the post-breeding season, so when the young have fledged the nest and the adults have to take care of themselves and get ready for migration, that migratory period and overwintering as well. So do these birds have the resources to carry over? And whether we want them to or not, they're going to use these urban landscapes. For those of you that are familiar with the Lights Out program that Harvey mentioned, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, birds come through downtown Cleveland. Sometimes surprising which species come through downtown Cleveland. Um, Things like Connecticut warbler, which some birders would just froth over, they get so excited about and maybe go an entire lifetime without seeing. We unfortunately find them on the sidewalk after they've collided with buildings and urban landscapes. So we can't put signs right along the shore of Lake Erie saying this is downtown area, birds go around. They're going to use these landscapes. So we have to seriously consider what that habitat looks like and how that urban and natural interface sort of reflects on how birds are interacting with it. And this is something that we could really take to great effect in Ohio. So if we take a species like Veery, for instance, this is a species that nests in Ohio. So the map that you're seeing here is pulled from the project that Harvey spoke about a few moments ago, the Second Atlas of Breeding Birds in Ohio. This was a large community science program that ran in the mid 2000s. And so the map that you're looking at is the breeding distribution of Veeries. So They're pretty much limited to specialized forested habitats, largely in the northeastern corner of the state. So depending on where you're at, if you wanted to see Veery during the breeding season, you would have to go to very specific locations and really seek out this bird if you were going to find it. However, if you just wanted to see Veery in Ohio, um, they've been documented across the states, and frankly, they're fairly common transient migrants. So that means that we get the pleasure of hosting, sometimes for just a few days, birds that are nesting in Canada and are just passing through Ohio. And so Ohio actually provides really important stopover habitat for this species. So if you wanted to see Veery in Ohio, you actually have a greater chance of seeing that species somewhere between April and early June, and again in September through early to mid-November. And so this is the time when that species is coming through in greater numbers. So we can actually provide more for this species and stopover habitat in Ohio than we can as a breeding species. And that's something that we need to think more and more about. What are the resources that we're providing for these birds, and when are they doing that? So if you're familiar with eBird, you may know that this is a website and an app for bird watchers to submit their observations that they see. So it's a great tool for birders to keep track of lists. And if birders are good at anything, it's keeping tracks of lists. But because of the amount of data that have been contributed over the past 2.5 decades, we're now able to do things with those data that were never dreamt of. And so what we're looking at here is the relative weekly abundance for veeries across the Western Hemisphere. Um, Historically, almost all of the conservation for this species occurred on the breeding grounds, really addressing breeding habitat. But take a look at this animated map. It does not pause during the breeding season for very long. If anything, this bird is on the wintering grounds the longest, which is actually out of range of these data. This bird spends a lot of its time in the southern Amazon basin, moving farther north in South America late in the winter as resources change due to drought and other seasonal resource availability. But they spend a lot of time on the wing as well, sort of migrating across the Gulf and the Caribbean and throughout the Appalachian Mountains. And they're not really on the breeding grounds for very long. So if we really want to address conservation of this species and others like it, we have to think about those resource needs, those threats during migration and during the overwintering period. And that's something that a lot of federal and state agencies are trying to grapple with now, because how do we spend funding on conservation outside of our boundaries, which is sometimes quite difficult, especially in today's landscape. But some of the states are doing it quite well, and the Ohio Division of Wildlife has been contributing to the Southern Wings program in recent year, which sends funding to South America. But anyway, we as homeowners and sort of native plants practitioners have a lot of potential in our homes as well. And so we could do that by thinking about creating these bird-friendly yards. But what does that mean? When you say you're helping the birds, or if someone says they're helping the birds, they probably have a particular image in their mind, which probably varies depending on who you're talking to. For a lot of people, helping the birds or having a bird-friendly yard probably looks something like this. Their yard is the sort of typical manicured lawn, and they've stuck a couple bird feeders out there. Is this really a bird-friendly yard? Is it helping much? Probably not. A bird-friendly yard probably looks something a little bit more like this, where we're thinking much more holistically about it, where we're looking at the vegetation and the native cover in there. Is it providing resources and cover throughout the year? And so there are many different concepts that we want to think about, not just this sort of concentrated food source, but really providing habitat in our backyards. We still have this European culture ingrained in us where we love to have manicured lawns. And lawns, for some people and for some families, do have a lot of value. If you have small children, that lawn provides that safe space for kids to grow up and play in. However, for many of us who don't have children or our own children have fledged the nest, this is an area that we should really think about reverting to or converting into bird habitat. And so this photograph on the right is probably something that we should be striving a little bit more towards. And we have a lot of potential to help these conservation issues and these sort of bend the curve on these population trends. A few years ago, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology put together this infographic where they tried to boil down 7 simple actions that every person could do to help bird populations. And I think this is a really great set of recommendations for folks. It's easy to digest and they can be really impactful. For the purposes of the rest of this presentation, I want to focus on just these 4 actions. So making windows safer, keeping cats indoors, using native plants, that's the one that's drawing many of you here today, and avoiding pesticides. So these often go hand in hand. Things like using less plastic, contributing to citizen or community science, and drinking shade-grown coffee are all really important, and we could have entire seminars devoted to just a single topic there. But for today, in our backyards, we're going to kind of focus on these 4 subject areas. So first, keep your cats indoors. I'll keep this one quite brief because it's fairly simple, and it's something that we all really need to take to heart. Cats are the largest source of bird population declines in North America, outside of just pure habitat loss. There are approximately 70 to 100 million feral or free-ranging cats in the United States, and they kill upwards of nearly 4 billion birds and potentially 21 billion mammals annually in the United States. Everyone who says, not my cat, I can assure you it is your cat as well. And beyond that, just the safety of these native wildlife populations, it's really not good for the cat to be outside and free ranging as well. They serve as vectors for disease, and also are at risk for traffic accidents and getting hit by cars. And so really we should be thinking about trying to bring down and eliminate that free ranging cat population. And TNR is not, which stands for trap, neuter, and release, not an effective strategy. It's been shown time and time again from wildlife research that these populations are not closed and that they continue to serve as pools or vectors for harming wildlife populations. Usually when I say this, especially at in-person events, there's a risk of having tomatoes and other produce lobbed at me, but I can assure you that I say this as a cat enthusiast and a cat lover. I've had many cat roommates over the years. My current cat, who is photographed here, has been indoor all of her life. She was rescued as a feral outside of my apartment in grad school. And here she's helping me enter data many years ago from the second Atlas of Breeding Birds. She's still kicking around now at 18 years old and is getting excited for data entry for the third Bird Atlas, which is going to start here in a year and a half. And so when people tell me that, oh, cats are unhappy inside or it's torture, I think that's more of a reflection of who they have as a roommate, and it might say something about you as a roommate if your cat is being miserable inside. There are lots of ways in which we can give our cats enriching lives inside. And if you want to give them that space, there are things like catios, which provide these fenced off outdoor areas that separate cats from those native wildlife. And this is something that you could do at a DIY scale. I know there are also companies that sort of assist in sort of pre-manufacturing and providing these sorts of things. So if you really want to get your cat sort of that outdoor enrichment, a catio is a great way to go about doing that. If you'd like more information on cats and native wildlife, that is available on the Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative's website. So we have a white paper there, as well as some additional resources, including webinars and scientific research about that subject. Make windows safer. And this was a big one. And we could talk quite a bit about this. And it actually, I think, interfaces with the subject of native backyards and native plants really well, because those two things should not be teased apart. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. In terms of threats to birds, windows are right behind cats in that. Updated research, so from Dan Clem, who's really the sort of pioneer in collision research across North America, published a paper just about a year and a half ago that updated our understanding of what the actual impact of bird building collisions looks like. And it is up to 2 billion birds annually in the United States alone. In our Lights Out Ohio or Ohio Lights Out programs, we've been doing some form of monitoring in many of the cities since around 2017 and have now salvaged over 25,000 birds as a part of that effort. And so this is not a superficial issue. This is a pretty large issue. And although we do those Lights Out programs primarily in the urban areas because of that concentration, the vast majority of the issues actually occur at low rise and residential properties. And so by that, US homeowners actually have a lot of potential to address this issue of bird building collisions, where almost half of the collisions are happening at our homes. Migration is this amazing ecological phenomenon. It's happening right now, and over the next few weeks, it's going to get more and more exciting, where over 3 billion birds are going to be coming to the US from Central and South America. Warblers are starting to show up now. I know at my property in Vinton, both Louisiana water thrush and yellow-throated warblers have been on territories now for several days. We're going to see a lot more of them pretty soon. The thing about this is this massive ecological phenomenon that's going on over our heads that goes by a lot of people is substantial. And research has shown that migration is actually where the pinch point is for a lot of the species. It's energetically taxing, so it's really hard to do this, and there's high risk of mortality. You might ask, why do they do it then? Well, even though there's high risk, there's even higher reward. So in temperate and boreal North America during spring and summer, when we get this leaf out and all this lush vegetation, which means lush insect and food resources, these birds are coming to North America to increase their productivity. And although that risk is high, it does pay off at the population level. Research on migration at Hubbard Brook is a sort of done this research with black-throated blue warblers now for decades. And they've shown that mortality for that species during migration is 15 times higher than it is during the breeding or overwintering period. So again, as conservation biologists, if we are interested in bending that population curve, we can provide, and we should be providing high quality breeding habitats, but we really need to be thinking about the resources and the threats to birds during those migratory periods if we really care about these species populations. And the biggest threat to birds is glass during migration. And so for all of these species, they have not evolved with reflective glass surfaces. And so what they see when they're looking into many of these reflections is the extension of habitat, not necessarily reflected green space. And so these two photos are from our Lights Out Cleveland project. So some downtown examples and some just on the outskirts of town, showing you the various scenarios that are abundant across our landscape. And this is the agricultural trend that we're dealing with right now, is this sort of glass curtain facade, essentially. And so there are many architectural reasons why this has become a trend, but suffice it to say, it's not going anywhere anytime soon. And it's something that we need to think about, especially if we consider how our green spaces interact with these reflective surfaces. And so you can see on the photograph here on the left, we've got a lot of green space adjacent to this glass building. And to birds, it looks like more trees to fly into. And this is happening everywhere. Like I said, the vast majority of bird building collisions happen at low-rise commercial and at residential buildings. And some people will say, well, I've never seen it happen in my yard. It doesn't happen at my house. Well, up to about half of window collisions don't leave any evidence whatsoever. Generally speaking, when we talk about the most obvious evidence, it would be a dead bird at the bottom of your building. But sometimes when they hit the windows, they sort of leave this feather dander imprint on them. But depending on the weather conditions and what's going on, there might not be any evidence whatsoever. And scavenging rates are quite high by both native and invasive small mammal populations. And so chipmunks, squirrels, are often quick predators and scavengers for these birds that are hitting buildings. So Yes, birds are hitting our windows. In most cases, we're not actually aware that it's happening. So if we want to do something about that, we really need to break up those reflective surfaces. Historically, some people have put these sort of bird silhouettes in their windows. Those alone, a one silhouette of a hawk on your window is not going to accomplish anything. The birds don't see that and say, "Oh, there's a scary hawk there. I'm not going to go near there." Really what it's doing is it's breaking up that reflective surface. So if we still want to use those silhouettes, we would have to pack them in to meet that density requirement, which is essentially a 2 by 4 inch gap in there. So generally speaking, we recommend 2 by 2 for simplicity, but you essentially need to break up that reflective surface. Now, if you're going to use all silhouettes, that's obviously going to really impact the visibility of that window. And so that's why there are these products like Feather Friendly that create these dots. This is actually a photograph of our house in Vinton County, where we've treated all of the windows on the back and have greatly reduced the number of bird collisions that we've had at the home. And as you can see from this next photo, it really does not impact our visibility outside. You can see my camera set up there. This was just a few years ago when we had that eruption of evening grosbeaks. And we were incredibly fortunate to have evening grosbeaks coming to our feeders, and I was able to get some pretty wonderful photographs of that bird through these windows that were treated with these dots. The American Bird Conservancy has really been the leader in providing information and trying to address this issue. They have a database on their website that indexes all of the available products, both for residential application and commercial, in terms of new construction and retrofitting. So glass windows that already occur on the landscape, the products that can go on there. So if you're interested in this, both at either residential or commercial, I encourage you to go to that website. So this is what we're all here for. So let me finally get into talking about native plants for a few moments here. So we really need to do this in our yards and really address that lawn issue. And so for the next few slides, I'm going to be pulling heavily from a colleague of mine, Dr. Desiree Narango, who we'll talk about in a moment, and some of the research that she's done. So some of her research has shown that, and we know that over 10 million acres were converted from forest to developed land during the 1980s and 1990s. And you all are aware, that's probably why you're here, that manicured lawns provide few resources for wildlife, and additionally require significantly greater input in chemical resources and things like fertilizers and pesticides. Native plants, on the other hand, increase the food availability and provide cover for birds. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the research that my friends, Dr. Desiree Narango, did for her PhD work many years ago when I was working on the Atlas. She did her master's degree here at Ohio State University looking at birds in urban forests here in Columbus. A lot of her dissertation work was done with Doug Tallamy, who I'm sure most of you know by now. If you don't, I encourage you to look up Doug Tallamy and his Homegrown National Park project that he's been encouraging over the years. But let me talk about Desiree's research for a moment. When it comes to natives, really the reason why we're pushing natives so much for birds and for the perspective of birds is about the food. And that's not necessarily the plant itself, but the insects that rely on those or might be specialists on those plants. More than 90% of plant-eating insects are specialists. The obvious one that you all are probably aware of, the sort of classic example, is the monarch butterfly and common milkweed. But for most of our native insects, many of them are specialists and have this sort of relationship with a native plant or tree species. And Desiree really looked at the success of chickadees in urban landscapes to really understand that connection between the decline of birds and the decline of insects in these landscapes. So her work with Carolina chickadees showed that they preferred yards that had more native plants. Their nestlings grew faster and were in better condition in yards that had a greater proportion of native plants. And overall, Carolina chickadees fledged more young in yards that had native plants. So reduce lawn, plant natives if you care about the birds. But what does that actually mean when we talk about that? So recall back to that slide I had earlier with the photograph of the bird feeder compared to that really lush backyard that had plants all through it. Here's that photo again. So I had Desiree actually translate that to me in terms of a recommendation. So for her research, she showed that there was this 70% native biomass threshold where birds were more successful, and that would lead to healthy, sort of sustaining or increasing bird populations. And so for the quarter acre yard, if we use that as our average, that means that that yard has to have 4 large trees around 20-inch diameter, 7 to 8 medium trees around 10 inches in diameter, and 15 to 16 small trees and shrubs around 4 inches in diameter. So that's a lot of woody vegetation in the backyard, and probably far more than people were thinking when they thought about having a bird-friendly backyard. But that's really what it takes for these small yards to serve as habitats to either sustain or increase the native bird populations that nest there. So in terms of recommendations, we provide resources through OBCI for landowners in urban and rural landscapes, and often make recommendations for trees and species like hackberry, persimmon, red elderberry, the viburnum group, flowering dogwood, and really any dogwood, and Virginia creeper. So these are all either vines or sort of under to mid-story trees, and not only all of them have soft mass associated with them. So they provide fruit resources, which are important to birds during post-breeding, migratory, and overwintering periods. But also they host a pretty large diversity of native insects, which are crucial during spring migration and during those nesting periods to raise sustainable birds. So I know, I really want to push you all to be working with Ohio native plants on and consulting and getting some information for your backyards. But if you'd like some general information as well, both the USDA, and I believe this is still functioning, as well as Audubon have some really helpful websites where you could look at a list of native plants for your particular area. And so for the Audubon website, you can actually go in, enter your zip code, and it will give you a list of both herbaceous and woody plants that are native to that landscape. To go hand in hand with that, during that transition, we also want to avoid using pesticides as much as possible. So personally, and in terms of the professional work that I do, I am not a 100% against chemicals. In certain situations where invasive plant species are out of control, herbicides are sometimes the only way to effectively manage those to sort of reset. However, they should not be used to maintain or sort of improve things like lawn and things like that. More than 1 billion pounds of pesticides are applied in the United States annually, and there's been a significant concern over the decline in aerial insectivores and the potential link to neonicotinoids. And so this is a specific type of pesticide that's being used pretty abundantly in agricultural use, but there's often also application for residential use as well. And so these aerial insectivores, these are birds that eat insects. So think of things like flycatchers and nightjars. Eastern whippoorwill and common nighthawk populations have not been doing well in recent decades, and there's significant concern over food availability for those species. We could again have entire seminars on mechanisms for chemical effects on birds, but it's multifaceted. So there's ingestion, there's dermal and inhalation, and interaction with the plant species. And just like there are habitat carryover effects and things like climate change, there are also carryover effects with chemical exposure. So meaning birds can potentially be impacted during one part of their annual cycle. Let's say that's the breeding season, meaning they're not in great condition to start migration. They might take longer, or even if they don't survive that, but if they do survive, they might take longer to get to the overwintering grounds. For species like American redstart that is territorial on the wintering grounds, they might be relegated to poor quality habitats And so we see this sort of snowball carryover effect happen throughout this bird's life cycle. And there's been recent research with that. So Bridget Stutchberry's lab looked at this impact on white-crowned sparrows and these carryover effect of insecticides and found this significant relationship for individuals that had higher neonicotinoid exposure. So really, just the effects of a single dose of imidacloprid affected body condition and affected migration of these species. And so these chemicals are impacting birds. So the more that we switch over to native plants, they actually require few to no chemical inputs. We can reduce that just by switching what plants are in our yard. We can also be thinking about this from an agricultural perspective or even in our home gardens. There is a lot of opportunity for integrated pest management as an alternative. So really, if we embrace birds and bird habitats as part of our agro ecosystems, those can function quite well. A friend and colleague of mine, Julie Jedlicka, for some doctoral and postdoctoral work that she did in California vineyards, showed that vineyards that had Western bluebird boxes were much more productive and that they needed fewer chemical inputs in those landscapes. We see this across areas where there are sort of large inputs. This has been quite productive in the West, where we see a lot of fruit as that agricultural landscape. It has not been as applied as much in Midwestern landscapes, but it's something that we should be considered because recent research has shown. In the last year, a colleague of mine here at The Ohio State University showed that that Midwestern landscape, especially from Illinois through Western Ohio, had some of the largest declines of grassland and open land birds because of agricultural and insecticide use. So with that, I want to make a pitch for you all to help us help the birds. Because you all hold so much of the land in your own hands, that means that you have a lot of opportunity and a lot of power as well. So think about converting your backyards to more of these native green spaces, providing habitat for a wealth of species across that full annual cycle. And lastly, just as sort of icing on the cake, I want to mention that research has also shown that in these urban landscapes, these urban forests and more canopy cover can mitigate urban heat islands. And so we can actually sort of counteract the localized effects of things like climate change and urban heat islands by producing and maintaining healthy tree canopies in forested systems. So putting trees in your backyard is just an all-around great thing that we should be thinking about. So a lot of the stuff that I talked about today is available in various resources on the Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative's website. So obcinet.org is that. We've got habitat management guides, some virtual webinars that you can do if you are maybe own some more larger property forest. And we just published with the Ohio Division of Wildlife a brand new guide for landowners on managing grassland habitats. So that just came out last month. It was debuted at the Wildlife Diversity Conference here in Columbus. So that's now on our website as well. So hopefully we have a few minutes left, and I would love to answer questions if folks have them. So
Thank you very much, Matt. Fabulous, fabulous program. And what a great overview of both the challenge and the opportunities. In the chat, let's see. Somebody had asked a question about confused about how to provide water without endangering birds. Can we talk about that a bit?
Sure. There are lots of ways in which we can provide water. I say the safest way to do that is to provide flowing water as opposed to stagnant water. And there's a lot of evidence that birds are strongly attracted to that. If you all know Julie Zickafoos and follow her on social media, she's really pushed this pretty hard. And I think she calls it a warbler fall or something like that. So even just a small trickle of water is really an oasis for a lot of these birds. I think the issue and where people have sort of shied folks away from having things like bird baths or stagnant water is those can be reservoirs for disease if they're not cleaned and maintained regularly. And I know we all let maintenance of things slip. And so an easier way to do that is by having flowing water. And so adding a trickler to that, if you've got a small stream or waterfall, just think about if you want to provide water, think about a water feature as opposed to a cement basin or something like that. So when you're providing moving water, there's less opportunity for that to serve as a disease reservoir and for mosquitoes and other problematic insects to take up there. So think about that. Think about adding some flowing water to your landscape. That can be really beneficial.
Yeah, I think Julie actually has plans for her warbler fall,
She
and the
does,
material
yeah.
and the materials like maybe it costs about $35, the local store, and all you do is you just have some shallow dishes and you move water between the two of them and a couple pots,
Yes.
and birds love it.
Yeah.
Okay, next we had a question about lesser celandine, and I know that that's an issue for everybody because it's just seems to be taking over the state. As a matter of fact, I'm sure in the future Ohio will be one big beautiful bouquet of yellow flowers. Unfortunately, it's non-native and it's taking over. And the question, I guess, is without using chemicals. This is more of a plant horticulture question. Um, how do you control them without using chemicals that are harmful to native birds? You want to weigh in on that?
Sure. And this is tricky. And this, I touched on this briefly a few minutes ago going through the slides, and that I am not strictly opposed to the use of chemicals in certain cases. I do use some. I have massive issues with things like Japanese honeysuckle, the vine honeysuckle, and multiflora rose. The multiflora rose is a little easier to manage as long as I'm wearing heavy enough gloves. It does pull out pretty well, but the Japanese, the vine honeysuckle is just atrocious, and it unfortunately does require some very careful and targeted chemical application to sort of reset that. Lesser celandine is a hard one, and I'm no expert on that. And I would encourage you to talk to the folks here helping to coordinate Ohio Native Plants a little bit on that. For some of the herbaceous things, they can be a little bit tricky, and you have to be careful about when they are pooled and when they are. And I don't recall the exact biology of lesser celandine, but I know for things like stilt grass, if you're not incredibly careful with how you remove that, you can actually do more harm than good by cutting it or pulling it. Because in many cases, when we cut these, it actually stimulates more growth for those. And I'm not sure. I know that lesser celandine's a really hard one, and people have had trouble with that. So I might redirect you to some of the local experts on that. Also, in the resources guides that I talked about, some of your best resources are talking to your local soil and water conservation district and the Natural Resources Conservation Services, so NRCS offices. They have usually county specific, or sometimes there'll be a couple counties lumped together with folks there who are professionals and can provide at no cost some consultation on your property. So both the Division of Wildlife has private lands biologists that will do this. They will come out and help you, Soil and Water Conservation District. So I encourage you to talk to some of those folks because they might have a better handle on. I know regionally there are some differences in how aggressive some of these plants are, and I just know that lesser celandine has been a tricky one, and it's going to become even more and more tricky in the future.
So Melanie asks, what do you think about quote unquote organic lawn care? It is unlikely I'll be able to convince my husband to go chemical free. He's very into big quote unquote healthy green lawn.
Um, this is tricky. I know that a happy spouse sometimes means a happy existence, and so I would encourage
Amen.
you to continue to push against some of those assumptions as long as your marriage can stay healthy. I mean, a big green lawn isn't healthy at all. I mean, if it requires massive amounts of chemicals to keep it that green uniformed color, it's not healthy. And you have to ask yourself, and you as when I say you, like the partnership there, what's the purpose of that lawn? Is it because he needs a hobby and that's something he can control? Maybe you can recommend some additional hobbies for him that will distract him. So some of this is joking, but on the other hand, I'm not. I know domestic partnerships are they are what they are, and so some battles are losing, but they are not healthy green lawns. Push back against that as much as you can.
Well, Matt, it's nice to know that not only are you an ornithologist, but you're a relationship manager too, or
No, no,
consultant.
no, no. I feel like I'm as much as a relationship manager as like the guys on Car Talk are. Like,
Okay, to maintain large hemlock, elm, and oak trees in my yard, I've been told to treat them and have been told that they are safe for birds. Any comments?
yeah, and for some of those, again, you need to be thinking about local invasive pest, and so some of those are fungal, some of those are insect. Oak is probably getting at oak wilt disease. I mean,
Mhm.
there are a variety of issues for oaks, but they're not quite as severe as hemlock and elms. I mean, elms have been facing a downhill battle for decades now at this point, and so largely, if you're thinking about American elm versus slippery elm is a bit more resilient there. So if you have a large elm tree and it's still alive, that's great. I guess look and see how healthy it is. Maybe have a local arborist come and look at it, because that Dutch elm disease does require treatment in order to stave it off. Otherwise, you're counting the days. Same for hemlock. So I am a Pennsylvania native and I've spent a lot of my life in central Pennsylvania and West Virginia in the Appalachian Mountains. And I have seen the before and after of what hemlock woolly adelgid can do in great density in those landscapes. And it's really depressing to see very large hemlock forests completely gone because of hemlock woolly adelgid, which is an invasive insect. So I know we had early detection of that invasive pest in Ohio. And there are treatments that are quite effective, and they are at the tree level. So again, you should be consulting a local arborist, your local NRCS office, local forester that can help you with those, because those things are very concentrated and specific, not harmful to wildlife, and may be essential to keep that population of hemlock woolly adelgid at bay. And the unfortunate thing is that birds are facilitating the spread of hemlock
Yeah.
woolly adelgid because they're migrating across the landscape. Um, However, that's a pretty scary one. And here in Ohio, because we are at lower elevations in the foothills of the Appalachians, many of those species that are common in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, in deciduous forests largely only occur in Ohio because of the hemlocks, because they provide that cooler, darker forest. So species like blue-headed vireo, black-throated green warbler, magnolia warbler, winter wren, as breeding species, if we lose hemlock, we will lose all of them as a statewide nesting species. So that's one that we should stay on top of.
In addition to reducing grass in your landscape, are bird feeders just unacceptable overall? Good
This is a
question.
million dollar question, and I feel like I
Yeah.
answered this question maybe on a weekly basis. And what I tell people is that for the most part, bird feeders are for you, not the birds. Um, and I'm not against bird feeders. I think that especially if you have children, or if you're maybe more of a novice bird or a bird enthusiast, they give us that window into the birds' lives and allow us to see birds up close. And there are healthy ways to do that. The first is that we clean our feeders on a regular basis. And so almost every time you're filling up that feeder, you should be thinking about it on a weekly basis, but cleaning them with soapy water with a very light bleach solution in there. So just a few drops of bleach will help. Otherwise, you're basically creating a potential disease vector there, and it's a trap as well. So, I mean, people sometimes get upset about the Cooper's hawks feeding on the birds at their bird feeders, but to the Cooper's hawk, that's a bird feeder as well. And so, for the most part, I tell people that you can feed birds. Try to limit its use during the winter and maybe migration seasons, but especially winter, you can keep hummingbird feeders out throughout the breeding season, but during the nesting season, pull in your black oil sunflower seed and thistle feeders. Those don't need to be out there. That's just potential harm for those species. But at other times of the year, if you are a responsible host for your bird feeders and you're cleaning them regularly, they're just fine to put out and gives you and your children or grandchildren an opportunity to get close looks at those birds.
Well said. Um, we have a question: how to get rid of carpenter ants in my house without causing harm to birds?
For your benefit, get rid of those carpenter ants as soon as possible.
Yeah.
And that's going to need a treatment. I mean, there's no other way around it, but it is really localized. You might think if you do have an issue at your home with carpenter ants, maybe think about if you don't have a lot of native vegetation directly up against the house, maybe hold off until after you treat the house and it's had a few weeks or a few months. That way that treatment is not soaking into all the plants that you're putting around there. So if you do a lot of annuals, you're planting stuff on a regular basis, maybe hold off in the flower beds that go around directly up against the house while you treat those. But for the structural integrity of your home, you really should be getting on top of those carpenter ants as quickly as possible.
Okay, Kat asks, how do you personally educate folks about the issue of, quote, leaving the leaves, unquote, vis-a-vis how important leaf litter is for building invertebrate populations for birds? And also, most people might already know this, but Desiree Narango is giving a
Wonderful.
free Zoom talk, How to Build a Better Birdhouse, on April 16th, sponsored by Grow Native Mass. Anyway, the information is in the chat there. But how do you do the educating people about leaving the leaves?
Yeah, it's really hard. I guess ask people, what their interests are, and finding that common ground. If they are bird lovers or if they do enjoy seeing the birds in their backyard, then that's an opportunity to talk about that. The leaves, as you mentioned there, mean overwintering insect populations, which is food for the birds. So it's often finding that common ground. Just like any problem that we're dealing with culturally, whether it's related to ecological or not, if we don't find common ground or a foot in the door, you can never science it. Like if that were the solution, we wouldn't be dealing with climate change and we wouldn't be dealing with the million other ridiculous things that we're dealing with this week, let alone currently. So we have to find the common ground there. So if the folks do care about birds, if there's a cardinal that they get excited about, then teaching them a little bit about the ecology of that species and what they really need. And if they want to see more cardinals or if they want to see more chickadees, then if they leave some of those leaves there, they'll do even better. So it's hard. It's an uphill battle sometimes, but as much as we can in finding common ground, I think those are where the successes are.
Wendy says, you might consider adding to your talk the overuse of leaf blowers, as I hear the neighborhood landscapers grinding away from March to December. There's no doubt about the fact that gasoline powered leaf blowers are a blight to the acoustic landscape.
Yeah, and I just today, even here on campus, it's a blight. I'm in the School of Environment and Natural Resources, and my 9 o'clock class on wildlife ecology field methods. We had a guest lecture, actually, Dr. Nathan Byer from Cleveland Metro Parks spoke to us, and all during his presentation, there were lawnmowers and leaf blowers outside the building interrupting him and my students. So yes, and if you'll give me the time, I could talk about a million other things that we should be thinking about too. But yes, they are uh, as far as a natural blight and an acoustic blight as
Yeah.
well.
Well, the other thing about it too is, the impact that it has on birds, that, birds being such creatures of sonic creatures, let's say, and that, if you're trying to compete with that background level of noise, can you
Yep.
actually be heard by a potential mate? Does it affect your ability to defend territory? Yeah.
It does, and there's been some really fascinating research showing that some species are adapting and thriving. Cardinals in some landscapes actually increase the frequency of their song to get above
Yeah.
low-level traffic hum and urban noise. But there's only so much plasticity in the behavior of some of these species. So
Jane just says, do not treat the oak prophylactically. They
Yeah.
will die. So if you don't just go and assume that you've got oak wilt, make sure you've got oak wilt, or make sure that um, I don't know if that's also true with the hemlock woolly adelgid or
Hemlock
elongate
should be.
scale.
So I will say in any of these cases, really seek out local professional guidance as much as you can. If you suspect you have an issue or want to know if you have an issue in talking about treatments, because the local professionals, especially the folks from like Soil and Water and NRCS offices and local private lands biologists, have a pretty good handle on the issue in the landscape and what the most effective treatments are regionally and site specific. So for anything like that, when you're concerned about large trees on an individual basis, do seek guidance.
Okay, and our last question is from Lainey. Do you have a specific viburnum type that you recommend? There were three in my yard that have been sadly destroyed by the viburnum leaf beetle, but I know not all species have this pest problem.
Yeah, I don't know exactly in terms of what species have some of the issues, and I know really, and again, maybe talking to your local native plants places where you're purchasing these things to talk about where they've had some of the most success because this does vary regionally. And I know I had a lot of arrowwood viburnum on my property and in our yard, which is wonderful. It provided great resources for birds and other wildlife. And we recently lost them. It was kind of crushing to lose like a little row of like four
Yeah.
really large, healthy viburnums. They were kind of all lost, and I suspect it was because of these beetles and other insects that were getting into them. So I don't have a specific recommendation. Again, this is where I would talk to the local folks who are really knowledgeable in the plants and what the population of some of those pests are regionally, because they do vary quite a bit regionally or in different densities. So ask them.
Yeah, and locally, folks, I would suspect that the Holden Forests and Gardens would be a nice
They're
resource for
another
that as well
really great
in our
resource. Yeah.
backyard. Yeah. I think that that's pretty much all of the questions. But before we let you go, and there's been a lot of comments, it's been a fabulous talk. Kudos to you, your presentation, your photographs, and your graphics. Just Matt's outlook. So, with the changes that we've seen, and given the urban sprawl, and particularly for someone who at least has got an office in the Columbus area, I mean, it seems like Columbus is just going to take over the entire state in time. Um, but knowing that with all the attention that was given to waterfowl and the success that we've been able to bring waterfowl and many raptor species, are you hopeful? Is your outlook one of hope? Do you see that um, there's a rising current of interest in such that we can save our bird populations in Ohio? Or are you pessimistic, or does it depend on the day of the week?
It depends on the day of the week. I will say that naturally, I am a little bit of a Debbie Downer and pessimism runs deep, but I strive to be an optimistic person. And as somebody who interacts with students on a regular basis, I am encouraged and excited about some of the enthusiasm and talent in the next generation of natural resource professionals. I do think we all need to facilitate that as much as possible. And especially in today's landscape where we like to tribalize things and point the finger and say, why aren't you doing something about this? Or why aren't they doing something about this? And I hope that as the theme of my presentation alluded to, the one thread is that, we all have great power here. And I think the more that we can encourage that and also take responsibility and that I can do a lot. We can't control what everyone else is doing, as we talked about some of these conversations that are difficult to have, but we can control what we're doing in our space, in our time. And I think the more that we all understand that there's a lot of hope in that. And I do strive to remain optimistic. And I will do that. And I encourage you all to do what you can in your spaces as well. As the best way to change the world is to, look inward and look at your own space and take care of that.
Yeah, we often cite Jane Goodall with her famous line, we all make a difference in the world, but it's up to
Yes,
us to figure out what is that difference that we make. And that's
it
sort of the
truly is.
premise of Nature in My Backyard is that,
Yeah,
following the Doug Ptolemy recommendation, can you at least take half of your yard and give it
yeah,
over to things that are native and create habitat and be part of a solution, not part of a problem.
yeah.
So anyway, thank you, sir. This was great. Thank you for all the work you do on behalf of Ohio Birds and Ohio's natural resources. And we'll see you on the birding trail.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thanks everyone for your time today, and thanks for the invitation.
Take care. Bye
See you.
bye.
Bye.
Wonderful, Matt. Thank you.
Yeah, no,
Everybody
thanks for the
learned very
opportunity.
good.
It's always good to talk about birds, and bird conservation.
Yeah. Well, it's a great, your talk is just another great way of bringing it home. And you know, we cite the Carolina chickadee study and the thousands of caterpillars that are required to raise just one brood of young Carolina chickadees. And I mean, it's just a powerful image. And the fact is that you've
Yeah,
got your black hour sunflower seeds. If chickadees really don't give a damn, they're not coming to your feeder and they're not going to use it, and it's not going to help them raise their family. So,
no, no, they
great.
really need that fat and protein in those juicy caterpillars.
Yeah. Jane, do you have a voice? Do you want to weigh